I'm talking about why the reasons the North won the Civil War. For first, I'd start off with the North had a bigger population because there was more cities, unlike in the South where it was just mostly farmlands. There was more jobs. Where there's more jobs, there will be more people that will tend to flock to that side so they'd support themselves and their families. Um, the Union had numbers of about 22 million compared to about 9 million in the Confederates, which 8.5 million of those was being slaves and were pretty unsympathetic towards the South's cause. Um, Slaves also took up a third of the population in the U.S., and the Union had units where it's entirely made up of African Americans fighting for their freedom against the Confederates. This made the Union Army have even more people fighting for its cause against the Confederates. The Union made up for about 90% of America's manufacturing, practically dominating the South in iron, shoes, boots, textiles, firearms, all sorts of production that was used for supplies in the war. The North had far more railroads that made it easier to transport the supplies they needed. To be exact, it was about 20,000 miles in the North compared to about 10,000 miles in the South for the Confederates. This made it easier for them to move their entire army, move supplies, move units into certain places and locations to form attacks and to get ready for certain battles. The North overall had a superior resources that the South could only wear them down after a very long time. Because the South resources weren't as prominent, they would be depleted very quickly compared to that of the North. Meaning it would take far more time for the South to have a chance of wearing out the North and tiring them out and trying to push them back, because the North just had so much supplies and their resources they were able to replenish so much easier than the South was. The North gained control of New Orleans, which basically made it impossible for the South to be able to ship any supplies up the Mississippi River to its troops. I think the battle was Vicksburg, I believe it was called, but the North obtained control of the Mississippi River, which was part of its naval force that was able to blockade all of the South's shipping routes, so that the South couldn't get any supplies out to their armies. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the South learned that they could never really again threaten a northern city because of its massive loss of life in that one particular battle. Despite that battle breaking out and the Union winning, it really struck fear in the North, because it had a high loss of life on both sides of the spectrum, and it worried places like New York and Philadelphia in the North that that it was beginning to teeter. But after that battle, it was really kind of a turning point, and the war started favoring the North, a victory in the North. Because the North started off with a naval force, they were able to block supply ports in the South, while the South was trying to start their naval force from scratch. Because of this, the South had no real way of getting the supplies they needed to grow their army. And as well as the North's naval power, they were able to have operations where they could just bombard South's supplies and manufacturing wherever they were making supplies for their military. Confederate camps towards the end of the war also became very ill supplied, and starvation became a rampant issue that they faced. Whereas in the Union camps, they were well supplied and were fed, rested, had new uniforms and equipment to really keep their morale high in their troops and in their entire military. And then when the morale is high in the military, the morale's high in the regular population, for people that aren't in the military. So there was a lot of confidence in the Union Army just because of how well they were equipped to go into battle. Also, really the only thing that the South was better at in the Civil War was that they had better leaders. Their only real advantage was that they had better military leaders that were able to strategize battles and plans, and forming these plans to be able to try to take on the Union Army, whether that was through guerrilla warfare became a big thing there, and they knew ways and tactics to try to even with their smaller force trying to take on a much larger force and be able to withstand a battle that would last days or weeks at a time against the Union. So that's just the reasons I like to highlight on why the North really won the Civil War. I think the main reasons just being the resources, their supplies, and their population. The South had drive to win it because they obviously didn't want to be under the thumb of the North's rule, but the North realized that if they didn't act upon it, and then the South would just kind of keep trying to walk all over them, and they realized they had worked so hard to get what they had the last 60 years, and they didn't want that being broken apart because of the South's different beliefs, and they needed to correct that and put the South in its place, and kind of slap their hand to make sure that they knew their place and make sure they knew that they couldn't go about this anymore, whether that was through secession or their beliefs on slavery. The North didn't want anything they didn't want any part of it, and the South learned that lesson pretty quickly after the Civil War started.